Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Jenna Weiss. I'm the Assistant Director of Public Programs here at the Jewish Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation featuring Christopher Rothko, Kate Rothko Prizel, moderated by Stephen Brown. Before we begin, I want to mention that we have a number of upcoming events this season, both virtually and on-site, including lectures, virtual courses, and live performances inspired by the current exhibition, The Sassoons, now on view in our second floor galleries. So if you didn't have a chance to visit tonight, please come back and do so. For full details, please visit our website to sign up for our e-news. And after the talk, copies of the book will be available for purchase at the table near the door and signing at the table near the front of the stage. And now I would like to introduce our speakers. Christopher Rothko is a psychologist, writer, and for the last 30 years, a custodian of the Rothko legacy in partnership with his sister Kate. He is editor of his father's book of philosophical writings, The Artist's Reality, and his book of essays, Mark Rothko From the Inside Out, was published in 2015 by Yale University Press. Dr. Rothko has helped prepare more than 24 exhibitions at museums and galleries around the globe and is co-curator of the upcoming Rothko exhibition at the Fondation Louis Vuitton in Paris. He is past chair of the Rothko Chapel Board and currently head of the Open Spaces campaign, guiding the restoration of the chapel and enhancement of its campus. Kate Rothko Prizel is a retired physician and daughter of Mark Rothko. She attended Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and went on to practice clinical pathology and transfusion medicine and teach pathology in the Baltimore, Washington area. As a young woman and still college student, she successfully sued to reclaim her father's paintings, which he had wanted to be made available to the public after his death. After she won the return of almost 700 of her father's works, she became the administrator of his estate and was involved in reconstituting the Mark Rothko Foundation, which donated the bulk of the artworks to museums, allowing public access to some of the most important paintings of the 20th century. Since that time, she has been actively involved in maintaining his legacy through planning exhibitions, overseeing the creation of the Mark Rothko catalog raisonné, and writing about her father. And Stephen Brown is curator at the Jewish Museum, where he has been part of the curatorial teams behind the recent exhibitions The Hair with Amber Eyes, Personas, George Siegel's Abraham and Isaac, Chaim Soutine, Flesh, and Florian Stedheimer, Painting Poetry. His research specializations are in the modern period with a focus on art and its historical, literary, and social context. And his articles and reviews have appeared in numerous publications and catalogs. Now please take a moment to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Christopher Rothko, Kate Rothko Prizel, and Stephen Brown.
Good evening. Can everyone hear? Yeah? Great. Well, it's a fabulous opportunity and every moment is precious, but it's my position here now to welcome Kate Rothko Prizel and Christopher Rothko, who are the stewards of Rothko's heritage, and to try to inspire a few questions. Of course, both Christopher and Kate have extraordinary memories that we want to bring out. And I apologize if some of my questions sound a little stilted. At some point, I'll probably pick up my papers and just throw them into the air. But anyway, thank you very much to Jenna for introducing us. My name's Stephen Brown. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here to celebrate and to discuss the new publication by Kate and Christopher on their father, Mark Rothko, who's surely one of the greatest modern artists and image makers of the last century. The book, as you can see, it weighs about 5 pounds, so it's quite a heavy. If you're taking one home tonight, you need an extra pair of arms. But anyways, it's a very beautiful book, illustrated with extraordinary reproductions of Rothko's great works and many works that have not been seen before. and also has the addition of 4 beautiful essays from Kate and Christopher, along with the art historian Alexander Nemerov and the renowned photographer Hiroshi Sugimoto. And so I'm recommending it's also published by Rizzoli. It's an extremely distinguished publishing house and very deluxe work and very accessible introduction and survey to the great artist's work. I'm thinking that perhaps, Christopher and Kate, we might begin if you could tell us a little bit about the Rothko family background.
Well, my father was born in Dvinsk in the Russian Empire, actually, as he always pointed out to me on the globe, now part of Latvia since about 1920. But he was born in 1903 and left Dvinsk in 1913, so well before the transfer to Latvia. Dvinsk was a mid-sized city, and interestingly, and I found out a lot of this more recently, it was a very diverse city. Probably about a third Jewish, about a third Polish, which I actually fairly recently discovered, and the other third mixed. There were a lot of Old Believer Russians who had settled in the area. So one thing that has appealed to me is this kind of historical diversity of the city. Of course, after the war, things were drastically changed, and there were basically no Jewish survivors in Dvinsk, and given historical circumstances, the city ended up being occupied by many people looking for housing in the Soviet Union after the war. My father actually came from a very well-educated family. His father was a pharmacist, and his mother had actually completed gymnasium, which I would say is sort of equivalent to completing junior college here, if you will, which was unusual for a woman of her time. And she was also born in St. Petersburg. We gather that her family must have been fairly wealthy for that reason, because there weren't many Jews who were allowed to settle in St. Petersburg, but we don't have many details. This other picture here is of my father and his siblings. There's also a cousin in this picture, I think standing in the center back, but we have here my father center front, the youngest in the family, his oldest brother to your right, and his sister and middle brother on the left. And my father left in 1913. His father and brothers had left somewhat earlier to try to establish things in the US. And the one thing I will say is clearly they were not driven for economic reasons to leave Dvinsk. It was much more occasioned by my grandfather's reactions to the pogroms of 1903, mainly further south in the region, but I think he had a very strong emotional reaction to the events. And as a matter of fact, he had been very secular up to that time, but from about 1905 on, he became much more religious. And in fact, my father was the only one to receive any religious Jewish education, unlike his siblings.
And in terms of when they came to America,
Want to get that mic?
Oh, Mr. Moderator. I'm thinking about these photographs of your father as an immigrant and as a new American. What were his formative experiences coming to? How old was he when he came to Portland, Oregon?
He was 10 when he arrived in Portland, and it was a formative experience in many ways. The most difficult thing was that his father passed away of cancer about a year after they arrived. And for him, this was particularly traumatic, I think even more than for his siblings, perhaps because of his young age, but also given his religious education, he felt an obligation to go to the synagogue and say Kaddish for his father. And It may have been an exaggeration, but what he always said to me was that he went for 11 and a half months and walked out of the synagogue, basically saying he couldn't take it anymore and he would never set foot in a synagogue again. And to my knowledge, at least with me, he didn't. But I don't think this in any way changed his connection to Judaism, simply to the formalities of the religion. So that started off a very difficult time, and that was followed really by a lot of poverty for a family which had never been in poverty before. They had been certainly solidly middle class in the Russian Empire. And I think a certain amount of resentment grew out of that, but I think my father responded to it simply by working hard, which he did as a student, and we understand he was put back in second grade when he came to the country, but within a few years had completely caught up, and in fact went along with 2 other graduates of his high school class to be offered scholarships to Yale.
Yes.
So on the left, you have the newspaper article from Portland, Oregon, and on the right, a picture of my father at Yale, which we've always kind of enjoyed since he...
It looks rather stiff on the right, but
Yes. And,
befitting Yale, but then he says, I don't look like this.
well, I think it befitted Yale, but the problem was Yale didn't befit him. And I think after about, I think 2 very unhappy years there, partly I think occasioned by being a Jewish student and feeling uncomfortable in the milieu for that reason, and partly being a scholarship student. He was very unhappy. He had been in economics and major. That is something, social issues had always been interesting to him. But at the end of his second year at Yale, he failed to complete his final exams, apparently writing in the exam booklet that he didn't know and he didn't give a something. So, and he left Yale at that point.
Yeah. There was somewhere in the literature, I think there was some note about him wanting to be a union organizer or a militant at some point. Was that something that looked like a possibility for the young Mark?
Yeah, I think very much so, in the sense that he became an economics major because of his, I think, growing interest in more leftist politics. And he also loved debate. He had apparently been on a debate team in Portland before coming to college. So I could very much see him in that kind of role. And he also had a certain dramatic side to him. In fact, he did some amateur theater during college back in Portland, and one funny story is that Clark Gable was his understudy, and we have actually found the documentation now. So apparently Clark Gable's girlfriend was running the company, so he understudied my father, who was apparently the lead. So I think there was that penchant for verbal expression, if you will, and I could kind of see him as
It
inspiring
just
to
strikes
that.
me, I wonder, do you have any recordings of his voice at all?
Unfortunately,
Zero. Because I always wonder, New Yorkers of that period, what their voice actually sounds like. It was so interesting. But he never grew the mustache in the way that Gable did.
That's true.
Let's go to the works, and of course Mark turned to painting and to art. In the book, I was very interested in the way that you do lay out in a very scientific way the various, I think, 6 periods of his work, the transformations, beginning with the realist works that we were looking at earlier on, this incredible painting of the artist's mother in the late 20s. So you have the kind of figurative works, as you call them, and then working through a whole sequence. Could you maybe say something about those various periods in your father's work?
Certainly, and I will just say that although I classify them into 6 periods, and I think my sister would more or less choose the same periods and nomenclature, I'm sure he would not have. So, artists don't necessarily think of their work as falling into categories. They're simply painting, and their painting evolves, and their thinking evolves, and that's reflected in what they make. So, but yes, he spends almost 20 years as a figurative painter of one sort or another. Interestingly enough, he writes quite a bit about not himself as an artist, but the role of the artist and what the artist does. And it's very clear at that time that he already sees himself as an abstract painter, but he's making clearly recognizable figures. I mean, not necessarily a portrait that you're going to recognize of someone you know. These, yes, but many of them far more murky, if you will, or suggesting a person, but not necessarily somebody that you would know. But already abstraction is creeping into his language, both verbally but also pictorially.
It's very interesting you should say that, Christopher, because we do experience that at the museum. When we had the Soutine exhibition here, I think everyone came to the museum expecting every single gallery to contain masterpieces alone. But what was interesting in the early work was actually to try and document some of the struggle that the artist went through. Do you think your father struggled with his art and to get through these various phases, or was it quite a natural transition? Like to move to the next series of works that you call figurative and then moving into mythological. Is it a struggle, or was it a natural succession for him of experiencing New York and turning to the urban scene?
Well, I actually think my father struggled with every single painting he made, and I'm not. I mean, I'm being facetious. I'm not, because he. I mean, even after he hits his stride and he creates that iconic image that we all know of as a Rothko painting, he never treated that as a formula. Every single painting, he's starting afresh and rethinking, and he has new ideas and new feelings, and he has some techniques he's using, but each one starts over, and I think that's certainly true early in his career as well. When every painting, he's trying to find a way. He has all sorts of ideas in his head. He's always talking about how an artist's work moves towards clarity, and he's trying to, with each work he makes, find a clear expression of the ideas that not only that he has in his head, but he wants to have a conversation with his viewer. So he's trying to put those ideas into a pictorial language where you can essentially have a conversation about some of these ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think we always feel that his decision to become an artist was a philosophical one. He wasn't one of these kids who sat and drew on every, piece of paper. And in that sense, I think he felt he had a message to convey to the world. And I think, first of all, it was relatively gradual. He decided that the way to do this was through painting. And then as he worked through each, period, if you will, he was still searching for what would be his real voice, to convey that message. So whether it was a struggle to make the transitions, I don't know, but I think there was always something up front that he was striving for.
Yes. I must admit, we have in the collection here at the Jewish Museum, we have one of these works from the early 40s, a mythological subject. But these are very, very exciting works, but you do feel that he was searching, but always certain somehow at the same time. You see that in an artist, and maybe ties into the existential things we were talking about earlier. But what about these works that come from the mid-40s, like the work on the left, the untitled work? Was surrealism something that he was just as subject as everyone else in New York was at that period? I mean, at this point, Barnett Newman was really almost on the verge of turning his back on surrealism also, right?
Well, it's interesting because almost all of the artists in the New York school, as we've come to call them, went through some sort of surrealist phase, although if you read my father's writings, he actually was quite critical of surrealism. But clearly, if you look at this work, the watercolor, he's adopting some of the methodology, adopting some of the pictorial images. So philosophically, he has different ideas about what it's about, but this is clearly the art of the moment, and he actually is on record saying that art can't help but be of its times.
Mm-hmm. This particular painting is very amazing work. Seems to have had a particularly interesting place in the development of the Oeuvre. It's not something that most people would recognize immediately as what you call a Rothko in diacritics, but it's clearly a picture that was very important to the family and to him. It reminds me of the Chagall upstairs that we have, which the portrait of his father, which is obviously so emotionally deep to him that he bought it back, 30 years after he painted it. And didn't something similar happen with Slow Swirl?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a painting, this is the period that he was working in when he spent several months or several summers in San Francisco teaching. So when he decided to make a gift to the San Francisco Museum, this was the painting he chose to give because it was very much, representative of what he was doing at the time. However, it was also the first painting that my mother had ever seen my father paint. He was actively working on this when they married in 1945. And it had therefore become extremely important to her. So at some time in the early 60s, my father arranged to have this painting brought home. And it was fondly known in the family as Melextatic, which was my mother's nickname.
And indeed, pictorially, this is our parents on the beach. And we've argued for years over which one's which. But,
That's right.
But in fact, he swaps at that point much more, and it's still at this point a much more valuable and much more a Rothko, a much more recognizable abstract work for this work. He felt that strongly to bring it home.
We don't have the dimensions, but it's a big picture.
It's a sizable.
Yes.
It's quite a large picture. It's already a mural size. The scale and ambition of this work, even though it's not a classic Rothko, already I think announces, his interest in that very ambitious kind of painting.
Yeah, really up to this period, he was working on the easel.
Right.
And we have an interesting picture of him with an easel by his side, but this much larger painting in the background on the wall. So this was, as he transitioned to larger works, clearly an easel was not appropriate.
These are two later works now taking us forward into the multiforms and the transitional works, I think is the structure you put them into, which is very good. But in this particular painting at Betty Parsons' gallery in 49, you're really getting to a different stage in the artist. This is really, he doesn't look very confident in that image, but nevertheless, he's made a great breakthrough at this point. I think you've already done exhibitions on this epoch of the late 40s when he makes a transition. Was Betty Parsons really an important supporter for him?
I think she was definitely an important supporter, and certainly the first person to give him, one-man shows, if you will, or one-person shows these days. But I think ultimately she was not a very good businesswoman. So reluctantly, I think the group of artists, and my father certainly wasn't the only one of the group to show with her, ended up leaving her gallery. My father actually, I think, being the last to leave. He couldn't quite bring himself to split with her because he felt she had really supported him, from the beginning. But eventually he left as well.
He kind of looks very isolated in this particular photograph. And one of the things, of course, that I think is very interesting is precisely how important the idea of working within a group, as loose as it was, with the New York School, how important was that for him, being involved in this vanguard? Was it something that he felt comfortable with, or did he feel he had to strain against it? He did have very good friendships with a number of the artists in that group.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly was friendly with a number of the artists and knew really all of them. All the names do you think of, Pollock and de Kooning, who were not his closest friends, but he certainly knew them quite well. But it was an intellectual milieu as much. They were not artists who would run to each other's studios every day. It was not like a Picasso and Braque situation where they're literally looking at each other's work every day. But they were engaged in conversation frequently, and they certainly were keenly aware of what the others were doing, and just a few years before that time, they were showing together because none of them could actually demand or command, I should say, a solo exhibition. So they were being shown together, however reluctant they might have been about that.
Mm-hmm. And I think also in the 40s there were a number of very transient art schools that were set up in the village, and those brought the group together as well. Also in the 40s, I think my father was particularly close to Barnett Newman and Adolf Gottlieb, and part of that arose, again, not of so much going to each other's studio and looking at each other's work, but more a philosophical connection. They discussed the meaning of art. They actually wrote a number of articles together. So
They really seem to have been the intellectuals of the group, compared, say, with a Pollock, for example.
yeah, I
Or
think
even a
so. I
de
think
Kooning.
they were sort of much more considered in their work, much more interested in writing about what they were doing.
So, that photograph is very telling. What about these two photographs? Obviously, the photograph on the right in the studio is amazing.
Yeah.
Just shows him working on a much grander scale than he had been before. Is there anything about these photographs that strike you particularly in terms of his practice or even his personal life?
Well, I think both of these photos are actually taken in the same studio, and I think this studio was important for my father because it was actually the first good-sized studio that he had outside the home. And it was, it was actually only a block from where we were living at the time, but to have this kind of space, was, unheard of for him. It's hard to imagine how he did something like Slow Swirl at the Edge of the Sea in a home studio. But here, he clearly has the room to start these very expansive pictures. And the other has just always been a key photo to me because it's such a wonderful portrait
such a
of
beautiful photo.
my mother and father, and it's taken in the studio where they're both sitting and really studying a painting of his.
Were you able to identify all the photographs of the family and of the artists that you have in your book?
Yeah, I think most of them have been identified. There's, there are one or two in our personal collections of snapshots that we're, still struggling with. But I think of the more formal pictures, we've managed to identify most of them.
Before you go on, if you could go back for 1 second.
Yeah.
We've identified the people, but that painting, we do not know what that painting is. We have to believe that he painted over it because no painting of that scale exists with a big white stripe on top. So either he abandoned it, or more likely he painted over it. But we've puzzled for years of what painting that is. And as many big Rothkos as there are, that is an unusually large Rothko. There are only maybe a dozen paintings on that scale, other than the actual mural commissions.
That's an extraordinary thought, because we were talking earlier, Kate, Christopher, about this, the techniques of the artist in making these paintings and how they actually accrue this kind of appearance of being at one and the same time very powerful and yet almost obscure because of the layering effects. And to think that he worked over a previously painted canvas, you would think it would build up and it would be crusty. He presumably just scraped it all down and started again, scraped down to the canvas.
Yes, although he thinned out his paint so much that he really was staining the canvas. Less in the early 50s, and in fact that blue and yellow painting is actually fairly thickly painted, but already by the mid-50s, many times it's interesting. I remember having some curators who wanted to see receipts from the studio, and what we have receipts for more than anything else is turpentine.
Yes.
Dozens of receipts for turpentine, because he's constantly thinning out these paints and really making them almost a stain for the canvas, rather than these layers of like impasto that build up on the canvas. And where there is more impasto, those are the ones where sometimes the paintings have not weathered as well.
Right. And,
Thank you. Let's just consider, if you wouldn't mind. I think this idea of both the essayists that you included in the book, Alexander Nemerov and Hiroshi Sugimoto, both emphasize not only the fact that your father was very much involved and interested in the art of the past, but also had a tremendous ambition as an artist. How do you see Rothko in the continuum of the history of art? We know, for example, and we talked about his trips to Europe. Were these direct influences upon him, or how did he go about? What did he choose to emulate, or did it just happen?
Well, I think in his trips to Europe, he was clearly very focused on Italy. And as these two slides, demonstrate, I think the getting left-hand one is from the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii, with these incredible frescoes, which I think you can really pick up the colors in many of his late 50s, early 60s work. And I believe he saw both this villa and also the Laurentian Library in Florence on his first trip to Europe with my mother in 1950. The Laurentian Library comes to play a major role in his first mural project, the Seagram murals. And, we often talk, particularly as you come to the mural series, about the architectural elements in those paintings. And so certainly the connection with that piece of Michelangelo architecture is amazing.
Well, what strikes me particularly is how, in a way, the two slides we've chosen here, which clearly works, the Pompeian villas and the Laurentian Library by Michelangelo, were clearly influential, but yet Rothko's art goes beyond them in a different way. These are very interesting spaces in which ritual and mysteries, are played out in the figuration of the murals. And in the Laurentian Library, you really feel claustrophobic, and as though you're caught inside a space you're never going to get out of. But in Rothko's work, you have this incredible, because of the technique, you have this incredible elevation, as though everything is moving away from you as you move towards it. It's a very unusual kind of experience.
Drawing you in a sense, but certainly not closing you in with a claustrophobic
That's
feeling,
how
I
see
think.
it. Yeah, in the technique, I mean, these floating fields. I see that.
But he certainly, in our other trips to Europe, had a great respect for classical art. I also remember vividly going to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam and spending a great deal of time with Rembrandts, and that was often repeated on when I was a teenager with trips to the Met and what he would tend to focus on.
Yes. So I would say that really, in contrast with, for instance, the pop generation, which follows just after our father's work, or really actually shortly after these paintings are being made, the pop generation is already coming to the fore, and they're making a very clean break. They're questioning the whole idea of high art. They're questioning the whole idea of the European canon, whereas our father, he said, what's the ambition on these trips? He sees himself as a continuation of a great legacy, of a great tradition of painting, but he is trying to really find the essences and really just express the essence of what you find in that work in the language that is, again, more universal and ironically, because abstraction, I think people didn't know what to do with it, but he was trying to find a language that actually was approachable by everyone, that you didn't need to have you didn't need to know every story of every myth, and you didn't need to have a reference book to know which saint this is and which scene of the life of Christ. He's basically boiling that down into what is the emotional and human essence of those works.
Yes, and I think in both cases, it's not just the history. It's interesting that a painter such as Rothko would be very interested in architecture and architectural space. And that seems to become something that's more and more important as his work develops. So that you have, for example, he's very conscious of the spatial impact that his work will have. And in a way, I guess that leads us to the question of abstraction. That was the title of our show back in 2008, Action Abstraction. And it was the language of his time, really. But he seemed to do something with it that took it to a different place in terms of his own philosophy. Is there anything, do you think this can lead us to some kind of understanding of maybe you have some insight on his spiritual relationship to his work, to the philosophical side of his work?
I think we've always seen our father as not someone who was driven by a desire to make things, but more really a thinker who found that he could express those ideas most clearly through through painting. And these works, they're contemplative. They're not made to be things that you can just walk by and get a glance and understand their essence. They're really made to dwell upon, and you have to participate in that. He's only giving you the suggestion, the first part of the conversation, and you have to bring the other part of that from your own insights, and whether that's a philosophical journey or a spiritual journey for you. I think he would say that for him it was both. But he wants you to travel with him, but ultimately it's going to be a different journey for every person.
And he certainly, I agree, wanted to get that spiritual message across, and I think that just keeps growing perhaps with his works from the Seagram murals on, moving in to his darker works of the 60s, and of course culminating in the Rothko Chapel. And we come back to architecture here, and that certainly is incredibly important because here he's involved with the architecture of the building as well as with how to place his own paintings. But the other thing that I come back to in terms of thinking of his Jewish background and what role Jewish religion might have played subliminally for him was the fact that he was, even in the creation of his own works, he was extremely contemplative, extremely precise. He would sit for hours working out the relationship between the edge of a rectangle and the edge of the canvas. And this he did numerous times. For example, with the works for the Rothko Chapel, he'd spend hours contemplating them and often made changes. And I wondered if that, came from the kind of religious Talmudic education that he had as a young boy, and whether that is something he might have shared to some degree with Barnett Newman and with Gottlieb as well.
Yeah, and actually thinking about the aspects of contemplation and an artist, I do recall that Vuillard, I think, once said that the armchair was the most important item of equipment in the studio. You don't have your father's armchair, do you, at home somewhere?
Unfortunately, no, but certainly some pictures of his sitting and contemplating.
Yeah.
So,
No, you see him in that pose often,
Yeah.
Let's since we're looking at the chapel in Houston, this has been very important, one of your projects in maintaining the legacy and continuing the legacy of your father's work. Can you talk us through some of the present projects and things that you've been involved in with regard to the work? I know that obviously you were involved in the restoration, and you were talking about the chapel earlier, Christopher.
Yeah.
And yes, and the picture you're seeing is of the chapel restored. It was restored just in time for the 50th anniversary a couple of years ago, and it's the only time that he really had full control over the space he was creating, and he had sought this. That had been a goal for him for years. It's really why he took the Seagram Commission, which was supposed to initially be at the Four Seasons restaurant. He took it because he would have his own room, and eventually he realized that was just going to be a very compromised situation, and that he would never win out against Wine, Women, and Song. But with the chapel, which was a fresh commission and brought to him with high seriousness, if you will, by the Demonil family of Houston, he had a chance to not only paint a group of paintings, but really create a space and create an atmosphere. You could almost say that these are not paintings. This is, if you will, almost a functional environment, that he has created a space where you can not just interact with the artwork, but actually spend a significant contemplative moment, and sometimes people spend more than a moment, many hours at a time, and see it as just a great place for a spiritual journey.
And I would say one thing, this restoration, which particularly involved the creation of a new skylight, has really been a journey. It took years to come up with a solution to a problem that my father may have inadvertently created. He had a similar skylight in the studio where he painted these pictures, which was covered kind of with a veil of very thin material. But of course, his studio was a two-story carriage house sitting surrounded by apartment buildings. And he had the illusion that the light in Texas might be somewhat similar, and that therefore the experience of the chapel would be similar. And I think what happened is the original architect, who was Philip Johnson, had actually proposed a spire to the building. And I think my father didn't see the need for this. I don't think this actually appealed to the DeMonniels because they were trying to create a relatively modest-looking building from the outside that would blend into a residential neighborhood, and they weren't enamored of the idea. But the problems this created for years because of the intensity of the Texas sun has only been solved with this last restoration, I think, kind of miraculously, actually.
That's very interesting because it does look, I mean, it's like the Oculus in some classical piece of architecture rather than a church. And in fact, it is a non-denominational chapel, right?
It is. That is not actually how the project started out. It started out, the DeMonniels were Catholic. They were extremely liberal Catholics and very open to art and all sorts of other cultures. And I think that that's one of the reasons that my father was comfortable with creating a chapel, even though he knew it would be a Catholic chapel. I think he felt so attuned to their kind of open spirituality that he was comfortable with the project. And it was actually only after his death that the decision was made to make this an ecumenical chapel, but I think he would have been extraordinarily pleased.
Yeah.
We actually even have some early drawings with an altar drawn in the floor space.
Really?
Yes, I mean just a very simple square altar, but that was pretty quickly removed from the plan. But I mean that's the degree to which this was intended to be a Catholic chapel. And he finished the works several years before this building was actually built, with the understanding that he was making work for a Catholic chapel.
So it really, your father's aims or ideas have been realized ultimately through the restoration of the chapel as a kind of as a universal space kind of thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, fabulous. It's very, very interesting. Let's just turn, if we have time, just to cover let's return to the book and just talk a little bit, because this is it not only weighs 5 pounds or whatever it is, but it's a considerable project, and I'm sure it took many years of research and work and many hands. It's a very impressive publication. It's a rich synthesis, and it's really complete in its coverage, and gives also, I think, very interesting in our time now, biographical context through which much of this work can be understood in relatively new ways. Can you say something about how you came to work with Rizzoli and why you wanted to make this publication at this time?
I mean, we've been involved with a lot of catalog projects over the years, and there have been wonderful publications on Rothko, and we've been in discussion with Rizzoli for years. But there was always, we felt, too many Rothko books on the market, and suddenly that was no longer true. Suddenly there really was not good representation, and we realized that not only was there a dearth of books, but that we had never, despite having worked with Rothko projects for 30-odd years, that we had never sort of gathered together all that we had learned and put it to good use and made something that the public could really have all the work together and see.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's nice about this book, there had been, of course, the catalog raisonné of the works on canvas, which was in print for quite a number of years, but actually was becoming harder and harder to get. But what is nice about this particular volume is it also brings together the canvases with works on paper.
Yeah.
Of which there are many.
Yeah.
And I'm going to put a little plug in. There's going to be a remarkable works on paper exhibition in the National Gallery opening in November. 2 floors of the gallery just devoted to his works on paper, and I promise you, you've seen none of these works before, very, very few, and absolutely must go.
Right. And I think one of the other unique things about this book is bringing in the voice of an artist, as well as an art historian. But I think bringing in Sugimoto's voice was particularly meaningful because of this joint, or in part because of this joint exhibit that was done of Sugimoto and Rothko in London.
Pace in London,
Pace in
yes.
London a number of years ago, which was really incredibly powerful.
And that seems to have, that particular response to Rothko from Sugimoto really seems to have been willed by the artist. He was almost, in his essay in your book, he describes, it's like a journey for him, really, going through Rothko, but a journey through all of the canon of Western art, really. It's quite amazing. And of course, the catalogue raisonné just goes on endlessly in terms of detail regarding each work. There's really more than you need. With your book, you kind of have a lot of beautiful illustrations and works such as, even from the great works of the classic pieces, all the way to small drawings that I'd never seen before, which give some insight into the technique and the achievement.
Yes, there are only a handful of these drawings. Our father did not typically make a sketch for a painting before painting it. There are exceptions to that, but with these drawings, I don't think these are actually specific to works. And what's always struck me about these is they're all in black and white, none of them in color. So people think Rothko, they think color, but color, I think, evolved in each painting. He had an idea, he would lay down a color, he'd lay down another color, and a color would evolve. But the question of what he called measures, what I would call form, and how those forms interrelate, how they interact with the human figure and the person who is standing in front of it, that's what he was really trying to get right.
And I think that fits very closely with his kind of contemplative approach to painting, looking at these relationships between the forms and the border.
Well, the whole struggle between line and color in 20th century art, it seems to be about that. And in a way, I imagine that perhaps for your father, maybe, color was the painting, or it was the means, the vehicle towards the spiritual state that he was striving to create.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it quite in these terms before, but if, when we think of, a Pollock or de Kooning and the gesture, right? But color actually played the role of the gesture for our father. The sort of architecture of the painting, the form of the painting was something that he studied very carefully, but I think the color evolved in a more spontaneous way. Now, it's a very slow spontaneity. I mean, you have to put on a layer and then another layer and another layer, and there's a plan, but it's one that sort of, there are sort of fortuitous accidents, if you will, happen, or things that come together in ways that maybe he didn't foresee, and then he takes another direction.
So he fought against being considered a colorist, but I think you're right, in many ways it was his tool.
Well, and some of the later works do move towards a darker, more somber tonality. And what about this? I mean, I love these later, the very late works are just so poetic. But he's also using a different medium at this point. It's acrylic, isn't it?
Yes, so he turns to acrylic for a very practical reason. He has an aneurysm when he's in his early 60s, and he's laid up for quite a while. It nearly kills him. And when he's finally coming home from the hospital, his doctor says, "Well, how are you going to make use of your time?" And he says, "I'm going back to the studio tomorrow." And the doctor says, "Oh no, you're not." And they have at least, as reported by our father, a long argument about this because the doctor was quite concerned about his heart and the stress of painting. So they finally agree. Small works on paper. And in that context, my father turns to acrylic for the first time and proceeds to make, I think I just turned myself off here. There we go. And proceeds to make more paintings in the next couple of years, despite his poor health and despite being quite depressed, than he makes at any other point in his career. And initially, they're all very small, and they keep growing and keep growing and keep growing to a painting like this, which is nearly 6 feet tall. And he's also trying to paint on canvas at this time, too.
Right, and the very interesting thing in this period, too, is he's grappling with a new idea, which is the concept of a white edge or white border around the works. And some of the works from this period show the border, some of them do not. So this is clearly another struggle he's having. And again, this to me comes back to the architectural element much more.
Absolutely, yes. We had a long debate this morning in a curatorial meeting about how to frame color-field paintings. It's not an easy question to answer at all.
Yeah, and my father would say, "Don't."
Yes.
So I mean, you'll see if you go to see this Works on Paper show. I'm plugging it again. It's not even my show, but you should go see it.
Where is it going to be held?
It's at the National Gallery. It opens in the middle of November. But you'll see that we've probably spent more on this project than anything else over the last 30 plus years, which is trying to figure out how to mount these works, because he always mounted them as like to make them look like paintings during his career. He did not frame them, he did not put them behind glass, and he had about 12 different techniques, or had other people use 12 different techniques during his career, and we've probably used as many since then, but each one, I think, getting a little closer, not just to his aesthetic ideal, but also to what will be safest for the painting. So you will see these works that really you experience as paintings, and yet there's clearly something that he is investigating, different textures, different ways that the paint comes towards the viewer by working on paper.
But it's always a fight with many private owners, sometimes with museums, about not glazing these paintings in one way or another.
To be continued. We have to rake your mind for some further information about that. But I think we've had a good session. I did want to leave some time if you wish to answer some questions from the audience. I'm sure people have lots of things that we've not touched on that they want to hear about. So I'll hand it back to Jenna. Jenna has a microphone, and if anyone has any questions in the audience, by all means, we have at least another 15 or 20 minutes.
And can we bring up the lights a little bit
Yeah,
so
that
we
would
can
be
actually
great.
see the lovely people who are
Yes.
talking to us? Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been so interesting. I'm curious about, after he left Yale, I didn't know, when did he actually start making art, and how that...
Well, one of his all-time best quotes is he came to New York to bum around and starve a bit, and he did that quite effectively. He was really working odd jobs, and as best we understand it, that was in roughly 1922 when he left, and he went back to Portland for a little while, but mostly was in New York. Somewhere around 1925, a friend invited him to a drawing class at the Art Students League, and he never turned back.
Right. Although I think the first group show he participated in was not until 1935. So many years of struggle and perseverance, even to get to that point.
And teaching.
And
yes.
also teaching.
Yes,
Yes.
As well.
teaching all through this time. So, actually, remarkably soon after he starts painting, he's already teaching at a small Jewish day school in Brooklyn.
Yeah. And interestingly, we always thought it was maybe one of his sort of part-time jobs, but we found out more recently he taught there probably for more than 25 years, and actually seems to have had an incredible relationship with his students, some of whom we actually met a number of years ago when this organization had a reunion. And he also wrote a good deal. They had kind of a newsletter for the community and for the parents, and he actually wrote a fair number of philosophical pieces about art for that as well.
Great.
Hi. I wanted to know if you had a relationship with your father where you were able to have discussions about his art and what that might have been like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I would say, unfortunately, not as deep as I would have liked. Unfortunately, I was 19 when my father died, and I probably was a somewhat, not a really difficult, but a teenager for a number of years
difficult.
before that. So
I wasn't there.
I can only say I look back with a great deal of frustration on not having those direct, more adult conversations with him. I certainly think there is a great deal I learned from him by osmosis, if you will, and by living with him, and certainly knew a lot about what he thought, how important the classical canon was to him, if you will, and I went to museums with him and he would make comments to me. But unfortunately, those formal conversations, like, why did you do this in this way? What were you trying to say? Are conversations I didn't have and certainly regretted. I took a train trip across the country with my father when I was perhaps 16, and it was one of those awkward moments when neither of us could quite figure out how to begin the conversation. Maybe he was a somewhat older father, maybe that was part of it. I was difficult. teenager, so a lot of regrets there, but I think a lot of things I picked up along the way anyway.
Actually, however difficult my sister was for my parents, she was always incredibly sweet to me. So I was a bit younger. I was only 6 when my father passed away. So we never had really discussions about art, although he would put up paper in his studio for me to paint on. I have no idea what I painted, and I'm sure he was encouraging, and I'm sure it was all garbage up there, because I never really took to painting. But what we did talk about, because from day one I was fanatical about music, and he also loved music a great deal. So I mean, really, from like the age of 2 or 3, we were talking about music. He would play records for me, and we would sometimes argue about who were the greatest composers. And so you know, it's like a little microcosm of what we might have had, but it was really something, and it's always stuck with me.
Hi, Kate and Christopher. If somebody claimed to have found a Rothko painting, an original one, supposedly, what would be the procedure to authenticate it?
Take it to an auction house. No, I mean, we have never been involved in authenticating. It's a very sort of slippery slope to deal with, and although I think we feel like we've learned a fair bit about the work, we've never held ourselves out as experts about paintings. So, you know, one thing is, I think people view the catalog raisonné as a sort of a document that shows what are the authentic paintings, but otherwise you have to take it to either the Art Dealers Association or one of the auction houses who will at least look at it.
I have a question regarding your mother. You mentioned your mother, but you didn't. I'd like to know, was their relationship, did it have an influence on how he proceeded forward in any of his work? Or obviously in his life, but...
I don't know if she had a direct influence. I think she had an influence in terms of being his greatest supporter and constant supporter in whatever direction he was going. You know, his work was everything to her. It was really the center of her life too, as I think for, you know, a fair number of women in that generation it may have been. And I think he had a previous marriage where he did not feel he had support from his wife in any way, shape, or form. And I think my mother was therefore an extremely welcome contrast. And I think she came to know a huge amount about his work and exactly, you know, what he desired in terms of his audience, in terms of what he wanted after his death for his work. As did I think quite a good deal just from hearing conversations between them.
How has your work together, collaborating on your father's work, affected your relationship with each other?
We don't talk.
That's right.
I think, you know, probably a function of losing our parents very young. We have always been very close, and we've always made sure that the relationship was first priority. So even when we were dealing with very difficult questions with the estate and what to do with certain bodies of work, including having to divide the paintings that did come down to us, we always did it in a way to make sure that the other person was feeling good about it, because unfortunately knew too many people whose families broke up over sometimes meaningless objects, and these were certainly not meaningless objects. So we wanted to make sure that always there was a sense of we were in this together, and we've always dealt with it that way. I mean, every exhibition, it's something that we agree upon, and whether one of us or the other one of us takes the lead in the terms of participation with that, we both make sure that we're both fully in before we proceed.
Yes, and I've been very grateful, needless to say, just because of our age difference. Some of these things, like the lawsuit to bring the paintings back into the estate, I was involved with. I wouldn't say flying solo, but certainly not with Christopher's active support, because he was much too young. But it's been wonderful, to have him really step up, particularly perhaps in the last more than 20 years, I think, when he's taken on so much of, preserving the legacy, organizing exhibits. Some of this I was doing as I was trying to work at the same time and have children. So having him really devoted to this has been invaluable. And I would say one thing we did, which I guess was somewhat inspired by COVID, is somehow we felt occasionally like ships passing in the dark, and we really, weren't talking as often as we should, either about family things or things related to Rothko. And we kind of instituted this weekly Zoom meeting, which has really been, I think, a great addition to our, adult relationship, if you will.
I see
Yes,
one
Yeah,
in
I
the
think
back.
there's one final question over here.
I'm intrigued by the reference to the 20-plus years of teaching in a Jewish day school, and I'm wondering if you have any details or understanding of how much classic Jewish education he got in his childhood. You mentioned his father's response to the pogroms, and whether or not he was fluent in Hebrew, fluent in Aramaic, fluent in Yiddish. Was any of that ever shared
Yeah.
with you?
Okay, I'll let you go.
Yeah, I think, I think we know that the family certainly spoke both Yiddish and Russian at home. However, I think my father, very unfortunately, was of the generation who came here and said, I'm going to speak English, that's all I'm going to teach my children, etc. So I grew up, unfortunately, not knowing a word of either Yiddish or Russian. As far as Hebrew goes, I think he was the only member of his family who had a Jewish education and learned Hebrew in any formal way. And we found in our documents a while ago, somewhat unexpectedly, some poetry in Hebrew, which seems to be written perhaps by a 12-year-old or something. And my husband, being fluent in Hebrew, had sort of gone through this. And, unfortunately, they're unsigned. We really don't know exactly what to make of them. But on the other hand, where else could they have come from? So I suspect, he had really a pretty good knowledge of Hebrew as well. Whether this translated into any formal, interest in religious ritual, I think is where I think probably because of some dramatic events in his life, it did not.
And I'll just to clarify, his own Hebrew education, which was just for probably 6 or 7 years in Latvia or in Russian Empire, was, I'm sure, quite formal and quite traditional. The Brooklyn Jewish Center was a super progressive place, very lefty, and I'm sure they were learning Jewish Hebrew. I'm sure they were, Jewish history. I'm sure they were learning Hebrew, but I doubt that they were doing a lot of ritual. It was a community center with a school. It was certainly not like going to yeshiva.
Great. Thank you. Thanks all for your participation. And thanks for coming to the Jewish Museum to give us such insights into your father's work. Appreciate it.